Federalist versus Anti-federalist. These two factions eventually led to the creation of our Bill of Rights and the ratification of the Constitution. After the Constitutional Convention ended, each state held conventions to vote on ratification. Remember, ratify means to approve. And according to the Constitution, 9 out of the 13 states must ratify the Constitution in order for it to become official.
Voters choose representatives to send to these state conventions. State legislatures were denied the right to elect these representatives for fear they would vote down the Constitution. Remember, at this point, each state had more power than the national government. Once the Constitution went into effect, the national government would be more powerful than the states. Not to say that the states would lose all their power, just some.
Let's review the blanks. Voters within each state would vote for representatives. They would try to keep the power for themselves. And the Constitution stated that only 9 states needed to ratify the Constitution. As more and more Americans learned about the Constitution, 2 factions developed. Those that supported the Constitution became known as Federalists. Those that opposed the Constitution became known as Anti-federalists. Do you see why they were named this? Federal is another name for national government. Federal, national, and central government all refer to the American government.
Some of the more famous Anti-federalists, and really the leaders of this faction, were George Mason and Patrick Henry. From your reading, you may recall that George Mason had proposed a Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution at the convention, but was voted down as other delegates felt that since each state had their own Bill of Rights, that was enough.
In general, Anti-federalists feared that the Constitution created a federal government that was too powerful, and the states would be back where they were as colonies under the powerful British government. Let's review the blanks. People opposed to the Constitution became known as Anti-federalists. Patrick Henry and George Mason were some of the most well-known Anti-federalists. Federalists were strong supporters of the Constitution, which makes sense, since these were the guys that were the big guns of the convention, and James Madison wrote the majority of the Constitution. So who better to defend it?
Alexander Hamilton and John Jay rounded out the rest of the Federalist leaders.
Let's review the blank. Supporters of the Constitution became known as Federalists. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay were some of those top Federalists.
After hearing and reading criticisms over the Constitution, the Federalist Big Three, Madison, Hamilton, and Jay, wrote a series of essays that would become known as the Federalist Papers. These essays thoroughly responded to each argument presented by the Anti-Federalist and became known as one of the best explanations and defenses of the Constitution.
In all, 85 Federalist essays were written. Most of them were written by Hamilton. Still today, these essays are considered to be one of the best explanations and defenses of the Constitution. Let's review. Federalist Papers. These essays answered each argument presented by Anti-federalists. Over 85 essays were written, and still to this day, these essays are considered to be the best explanation and defense of the Constitution. Here are some of the main arguments presented by the Anti-federalists. Notice the similarity these concerns have to the concerns colonists faced under British rule. Anti-federalists argued that a standing army in peacetime was dangerous. Patrick Henry was remembering the days of the British soldiers when they lived with the colonists.
George Mason had already argued the need for a Bill of Rights to protect individual freedoms such as freedom of speech. This was such an important liberty to America and had been restricted by Britain. Americans believed in the ability to speak their minds and disagree with the government. George Mason and other Anti-federalists believed that without a Bill of Rights in place, the government could deny rights like freedom of speech.
The president, they felt, would be too similar to a king. Anti-federalists felt there was no need for one individual to hold such a powerful position. They also felt this power was not restricted enough by the other two branches, and it would be extremely easy for the president to assume absolute control over America.
Since the federal government would have more power than state governments, many Anti-federalists feared that state governments would lose all power and control over policies within their own boundaries. States' rights is a very important issue in America and will be yet another cause of the Civil War. States felt they should be able to decide what federal laws they wanted to follow and which ones did not apply to them or that they found unconstitutional.
Yet another argument dealt with the expense of such a large federal government. Doesn't this sound like a familiar argument? Still today, Democrats and Republicans argue over the expenses of the national government. Let's review your blanks. Standing armies in peacetime were dangerous. A Bill of Rights? No Bill of Rights was present to protect the liberties of individual citizens. The president would be too powerful and could become a king. The federal government would totally control states. A large federal government is expensive. In response to these criticisms, the Federalist Papers fully explain reasoning behind certain constitutional aspects.
At the convention, delegates decided that a standing army in peacetime was necessary to the defense of America, especially at this time when respect was dwindling from other countries. America needed to be prepared in case of an invasion. The Native Americans alone were enough for some to warrant having a standing army. The Federalists also argued that the army would be controlled by two groups: a civilian president who would have the power to move troops. However, Congress would control all expenses of the military as well as retain power to declare war.
In response to the need for a Bill of Rights, Federalists argued that each state already had its own Bill of Rights, and this was sufficient. Having a federal Bill of Rights would only be redundant.
To the Federalists, the failure of the Articles of Confederation proved that a strong national government was needed. We have already seen the failures of a weak federal government. In order for our country to grow economically, we needed a strong federal government. Think about our issues with foreign countries and trade. By establishing a strong federal government, we could strengthen our foreign trade. A system of checks and balances would be in place to keep any one branch from becoming too powerful.
Since our new government would be more efficient than the Articles of Confederation, cost would not be an issue, and any additional expense was necessary for our country to exist. Let's review the blanks. Standing army was necessary to our defense. President's power is checked and balanced by the other two branches. Through the creation of the Federalist Papers, and after much debate, the states began to ratify or approve the Constitution. In the end, compromise was once again reached between the two sides. It was decided a Bill of Rights would be added to the Constitution. These are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution.
Thankfully, our founding fathers realized the need for the Constitution to be changed or amended as time progressed. They created an amendment process just for this reason. Therefore, the first 10 amendments were the first examples of the amendment process in action.
As you might already know, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify the Constitution, making it official. Rhode Island was the last to ratify the Constitution because of their fears of losing power to bigger states.
In 1791, the promise of a Bill of Rights was fulfilled. James Madison once again proved himself to be the father of the Constitution by writing the Bill of Rights, a document that is used every single day.
Let's review the blanks. Federalists give in and agree to a Bill of Rights. June 1788
New Hampshire.
becomes the 9th state,
Rhode Island.
becomes the last state. And James Madison writes 10 amendments to the Constitution added in
1791.